the War of the Stars. In the vast expanse of the cosmos, where the light of distant stars flickered like the breath of ancient gods, a war unlike any before had begun. Across the heavens, civilizations that had once flourished in harmony now stood on the precipice of annihilation. The galaxy, a tapestry of luminous worlds and shadowed voids, had become a battlefield where the fate of countless beings hung in the balance. It was not a war of mere conquest, nor one of territorial expansion, but a war of ideologies, of existence itself. At the heart of this conflict stood two great powers, the Starborn, an ancient and noble race who had long safeguarded the balance of the cosmos, and the Voidborn, a people of darkness who sought dominion over the stars, believing that only through total destruction could true order be achieved. The Starborn, with their luminous cities suspended in the heavens, had for eons upheld the harmony of the universe, guiding the lesser civilizations in the art of peace and knowledge. But the Voidborn, whose very existence was a mystery even to the scholars of the Starborn, had emerged from the voids between the stars, their motives shrouded in shadow. They did not seek to rule through wisdom or diplomacy, but through fear and the unrelenting force of annihilation. The war had begun with the first clash of their fleets, when the Voidborn, in a single, devastating strike, had shattered the great citadel of Valerion, a beacon of Starborn civilization. The survivors, scattered and broken, had watched in horror as the Voidborn ships, dark and unyielding, descended upon the stars, turning once great worlds into desolation. The Starborn, though proud and resolute, had been forced to take up arms, their once peaceful ways now turned to the bitter necessity of war. Yet the war was not merely a contest of strength, it was a battle of wills, of the very nature of existence itself. The Starborn believed in the sanctity of life, in the light that guided the cosmos, while the Voidborn saw only the inevitability of decay and the necessity of destruction. And so the war raged on, an endless struggle between light and shadow, between hope and despair, across the vastness of the stars. The captain of the Starborn among the Starborn, few bore the weight of destiny as heavily as Captain Arion Vael. In man of quiet strength and unwavering resolve, he had long served as a commander in the festivity of decay and the necessity of destruction. And so the war raged on, an endless struggle between light and shadow, between hope and despair. Starborn fleet, his name spoken with reverence in the halls of Ilarion and beyond. Born in the luminous city of Luthen, where the stars themselves seemed to whisper wisdom into the hearts of its people, Arion had been raised on the teachings of the ancients, those who had first harnessed the light of the cosmos to forge a path of peace. Yet even in his youth he had known the burden of duty, the knowledge that peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered by those who sought dominion over the stars. Now, as the war raged on, Arion stood at the helm of the Aetherion, one of the last great vessels of the Starborn fleet. The ship, a marvel of celestial engineering, bore the mark of the ancients, its hull woven with threads of starlight, its engines powered by, were the stars themselves, thing easily shattered by those who sought dominion over the stars. Now as the war raged on, Arion stood at the helm of the celestial engineering, the very essence of the cosmos. It was a vessel of hope, and yet, as Arion gazed upon the distant shadows that loomed on the horizon, he could not shake the weight of uncertainty that pressed upon him. The war had changed him. Where once he had believed in the sanctity of life and the power of unity and wisdom, he now found himself questioning the very nature of the battle he had sworn to fight. The Voidborn were not mere enemies, they were a people of darkness, their motives as unknowable as the voids between the stars. And yet, they had not come to the war as mere aggressors. They had come with purpose, with a vision of a universe that did not need the light of the Starborn to guide it. Tenriel, so 10. Arion had always believed that war was a necessary evil, a last resort when all else had failed. But as he stood upon the bridge of the Sacatherian, watching the distant fires of a fallen world, he could not help but wonder if the war was the true enemy. If the Starborn continued their fight with unyielding determination, would they not become no different from the Voidborn? Would they not, in their pursuit of victory, become the very thing they sought to destroy? And yet, despite the doubts that gnawed at the edges of his mind, Arion knew that he could not turn away. The Starborn had suffered too much, their people had been scattered, their cities had been reduced to ash. He had seen the faces of the fallen, the eyes of the survivors filled with sorrow and rage. He had seen the Voidborn Haikwai pumping, the Voidborn a jest that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Arion knew that he could not turn away. Descend upon the stars like vultures, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. The time for hesitation had passed. The time for action had come. And as the Aetherion prepared for its next mission, Arion knew that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the strength of the Starborn, with the light of the cosmos burning within him. The battle plans of the Starborn, the Aetherion covered in the vast emptiness of space, its engines humming with the energy of the cosmos. Around it, the Starborn fleet gathered, a constellation of luminous vessels, each one a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the Starborn people. They were a force to be reckoned with, but even they knew that the Voidborn were not to be underestimated. The Voidborn ships, dark and unyielding, had descended upon the stars, with an unrelenting force that had left entire worlds in ruin. The Starborn had no choice but to prepare for a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Commander Dane, Arion's trusted advisor, stood beside him on the bridge, his expression grim. "The Voidborn are moving in force," he said, his voice low. "They've taken the planet of Zalara, and they're advancing toward the next system. If we don't act now, they'll have a foothold in the core." Arion nodded, his eyes scanning the tactical display. The Voidborn's fleet was vast, their ships moving in a coordinated formation that spoke of an intelligence beyond mere aggression. They were not merely raiding worlds, they were executing a plan, a strategy that had been meticulously crafted to break the will of the Starborn. "We can't let them." "Take another world," Arion said, his voice steady. "We need to strike first." The crew of the Ictherian was no stranger to the weight of battle. They had fought before, and they had lost. But they had also endured, and they had survived. The Starborn had long believed in the power of unity, in the strength that came from standing together against the darkness. Now, as the war reached its most critical moment, that belief would be tested like never before. The fleet was divided into 3 wings, each with its own role in the upcoming engagement. The Ictherion and its sister ships would form the vanguard, leading the charge against the Voidborn's forces. The second wing would provide support, launching a barrage of energy weapons to weaken the enemy's defenses. The third wing, the most elite of battle. The fleet was divided into 3 wings, each with its own role in the upcoming engagement. The Ictherion and its sister ships would form the vanguard, leading the charge against the Voidborn's forces. The third wing, the Starborn fleet, would be held in reserve, ready to strike at the heart of the Voidborn's command. But even with their numbers, the Starborn knew they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Voidborn were not merely warriors, they were tacticians, their strategies as inscrutable as the voids between the stars. They had no need for cities or monuments, they thrived in the darkness, their very existence a challenge to the light of the Starborn. As the crew of the Ictherians prepared for the battle ahead, tension crackled in the air. Some among them were filled with a sense of purpose, their hearts alight with the hope of victory. Others, however, were burdened by the weight of the past, the memories of fallen comrades and the knowledge of what had already been lost, the very existence a challenge to the light of the Starborn. As the crew of the Ictherians prepared for the battle ahead, tension crackled in the air. Arion could feel the weight of their expectations pressing upon him. He had always believed in the power of the Starborn, in their ability to stand against the darkness and emerge victorious. But as he looked out at the vast expanse of space, he could not shake the feeling that this battle would be unlike any before. The Voidborn were coming, and they would not be stopped. The first clash. The stars above flickered with the tension of impending battle, their distant glow a silent witness to the coming storm. The Ictherian and the Starborn fleet surged forward, their luminous hulls gleaming in the cold light of the cosmos. The Voidborn, in contrast, moved like a shadow across the void, their dark vessels forming a jagged wedge that cut through the emptiness with an eerie precision. A single command from Arion, and the Ictherion launched its first salvo. Bolts of energy, brighter than the stars themselves, streaked through the void, striking the Voidborn's fleet with the force of 1,000 suns. The enemy ships recoiled, their dark forms momentarily illuminated by the brilliance of the Starborn's weapons. Explosions erupted in the distance, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. But the Voidborn did not falter. With a single, coordinated movement, their fleet split into 2, their ships darting like phantoms through the chaos. They were no longer a single force. They had become a storm of destruction, their weapons blazing with a cold, unrelenting fury. The Starborn's second wing opened fire, their energy cannons unleashing a torrent of destruction upon the enemy. The void between the stars seemed to tremble with the force of the battle, the light of the Starborn clashing with the darkness of the Voidborn in a war of fire and shadow. Arion stood at the helm, his heart pounding with the weight of command. The Ictherian was the vanguard, and he knew that the success of the battle depended on his every decision. He could see the first wave of Voidborn ships closing in, their weapons charging with an ominous energy. "Commander Dane, prepare the Ictherian for evasive maneuvers," Arion ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Dane nodded, his hands moving swiftly across the console. "Evasive maneuvers engaged, all systems ready for combat." The Ictherian twisted through the battlefield, its engines roaring with the force of the cosmos. The Voidborn's ships, relentless and unyielding, pursued them with the speed that defied logic. Arion ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The Ictherian altered his bosive. Could see the first of the enemy ships closing in, their weapons glowing with an unnatural light. "Brace for impact!" he called out, his voice cutting through the din of battle. The first explosion tore through the Ictherian's shields, sending a shock wave through the ship. The crew of the Aetherion barely had time to react before the second wave of Voidborn ships joined the attack, their weapons firing in unison. The Aetherion was forced into a desperate maneuver, its engines flaring as it twisted away from the onslaught. The battle was unlike any the Starborn had ever faced. The Voidborn were not merely fighting for survival. They were fighting with a purpose, a will that seemed to be drawn from the very darkness of the void. They moved with a precision that defied the chaos of war. Their attacks calculated, their movements unrelenting. Arion's mind raced as he assessed the battlefield. The Starborn's second wing was holding their ground, but the Voidborn were pushing them back, their overwhelming numbers and relentless assault forcing the Starborn into a defensive position. The third wing, the reserve forces, was still in position, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew that if they did not act now, the Voidborn would break through the Starborn's defenses and reach the heart of the fleet. The Aetherion and its crew would be the first to face the enemy's full might. "Commander Dane," Arion said, his voice firm, "we need to draw their attention. If we can force them to focus on us, we may have a chance to turn the tide." "You're risking the Aetherion," he said. "I know," Arion replied, "but if we don't act, the entire fleet will fall." The Aetherion surged forward, its engines flaring with the light of the cosmos. The Voidborn ships turned toward them, their weapons charging once more. The battle had begun in earnest, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. The weight of war. As the Aetherion surged forward, the battle raging around it, Arion felt the weight of the war pressing upon him like a storm that would not relent. He had always believed in the Starborn's cause, in the sanctity of life, in the necessity of defending the light against the darkness. And yet, as he stood on the bridge of his ship, watching the Voidborn's relentless assault, he could not shake the gnawing doubt, and Arion felt the weight of the war pressing upon him like a storm that would not relent. He had always believed in the Starborn's cause, that had taken root in his mind. Was this war truly just? He had spent his life fighting for the Starborn, for the unity of the cosmos, for the preservation of the light that guided the stars. He had seen the Voidborn descend upon the worlds of the Starborn like vultures, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. He had seen the faces of the fallen, the eyes of the survivors filled with sorrow and rage. And yet, as he watched the Voidborn ships tear through the sky, he could not help but wonder if the Starborn had become no different from their enemies. War was not a simple matter of right and wrong. It was a choice, a decision made in the face of destruction. And Arion had made that choice long ago. He had chosen to fight, to stand against the Voidborn and protect the stars from their relentless advance. But as he looked upon the battlefield, he could not ignore the truth that had been gnawing at him since the war had begun. The Voidborn were not merely aggressors. They were a people of darkness, yes, but they were not without purpose. They believed in a vision of the cosmos that was unlike anything the Starborn had ever known. They saw the stars not as beacons of life and hope, but as a necessity of destruction, a force that must be harnessed to bring order to the void. And yet, in their pursuit of that vision, they had brought only ruin. Arion had always believed that the Starborn were the true guardians of the cosmos, that their way of life, their belief, he was not ignoring of the Taxstat, and a boutany of life and hope that is a necessity of destruction, a force that must be harnessed, when he had brought only ruin. In unity and wisdom was the path that would lead to peace. But now, as he stood upon the bridge of the Aetherion, he could not ignore the fact that the Starborn had not always been the only force in the galaxy. They had not always been the only ones who had sought to shape the stars. He thought of the ancient texts, the teachings of the ancients, the stories passed down through generations. They spoke of a time when the Starborn had not been the only ones who had walked the stars, when other civilizations had once flourished in the heavens. And yet, those civilizations had once flourished in the heavens, their names lost to time. Had they been destroyed by the Voidborn? Or had they chosen to disappear, to fade into the void rather than face the war that had consumed? The cosmos? The thought unsettled him. He had always believed that the Starborn were the only ones who had the wisdom to preserve the balance of the cosmos. But now, as he looked upon the battlefield, he could not help but wonder if that belief had been a mistake. The crew of the Aetherion had always followed his lead, their faith in him unshaken. But he could see the doubt in their eyes, the uncertainty that had taken root in their hearts. Even the most steadfast among them had begun to question the war, to wonder if the Starborn had made the right choice in fighting the Voidborn. And he too was beginning to wonder. Was this war truly worth the cost? He had always believed that the Starborn were the only ones who had the wisdom to preserve the balance of. The Starborn were the only ones who could stand against the Voidborn, that their light was the only force that could hold back the darkness. But now, as the battle raged on, as the Voidborn ships tore through the sky, he could not help but wonder if the Starborn had already lost the war. And if they had, what would be left of the stars? The shadow of the Voidborn. The Aetherion had barely escaped the first wave of the Voidborn's assault, but the enemy was not finished. As Arion's ship twisted through the battlefield, he could see the Voidborn's forces regrouping, their dark vessels forming a new formation that was unlike anything the Starborn had encountered before. It was not a simple attack, it was a calculated maneuver, a strategy that spoke of intelligence and purpose. Then, from the depths of the Voidborn ships twisted through the Voidborn's assault, As Arion's ship twisted through the battlefield, he could see the Voidborn's forces regrouping, their dark vessels forming a new formation that was unlike anything the Starborn had encountered before. Something moved. A flicker of darkness, unlike any shadow the Starborn had ever seen, began to emerge from the void between the stars. It was not a ship, nor a weapon, but something else entirely, something that defied the very laws of the cosmos. At first, it was only a whisper of shadow, a ripple in the fabric of space. But as it grew, it became something more, something that could not be ignored. Commander Dane. Arion's voice was tight with urgency. What is that? Dane's eyes widened as he studied the tactical display. It's not a ship, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's something else, something we've never seen before. The shadow was not moving like the Voidborn ships. It was not following any known trajectory, nor was it responding to any known. Commander Dane, Arion's voice was tight with urgency. What is that? Dane's eyes widened as he studied the tactical display. Force. It was simply there, an extension of the void itself, as if it had always been waiting for the moment to reveal itself. Then, without warning, the shadows surged forward. The Etherion barely had time to react before the darkness enveloped them. It was not a physical attack, but something more insidious. The ship's sensors went dark, the lights flickered, and the crew was thrown into a sudden suffocating silence. The Voidborn ships, which had been in the midst of their assault, suddenly stopped. They were no longer moving, as if frozen in place by the very presence of the shadow. What the? Dane's voice was filled with disbelief. It's not just a weapon, it's something that's consuming them. Always been an enemy of the Starborn, but this was something else. This was not a battle of strength or strategy. This was something that defied the very nature of existence. And then the shadow moved. It was not a single entity, but a vast, shifting mass that seemed to stretch across the void, its form constantly changing, as if it were not bound by any physical laws. It was not attacking the Etherian directly, but it was pressing against them, its presence a weight that seemed to crush the very soul of the ship. Arion, we need to move, Dane said, his voice strained. If we don't, we'll be consumed. If we don't, we'll be consumed. Arion nodded, his mind racing. The Etherian had always been a vessel of light, a beacon of hope in the darkness. But now, as the Etherian rectly, but it was pressing against them, its presence a weight that seemed to crush the very soul of the ship. Shadow pressed against them. He could feel the weight of the void pressing in on all sides. He had to act. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear that gripped him. We need to break free before it's too late. The Ixtharian twisted through the void, its engines flaring with the light of the cosmos. The shadow followed, its form shifting and stretching as if it were alive, as if it were drawn to the very essence of the Ixtharian. But the Voidborn were not the only ones who had seen this new force. The Starborn's other ships, still in the midst of the battle, had also begun to notice the shadow's presence. Some of them were already retreating, their weapons faltering as they struggled to fight against something they could not see. And Arion knew with a sinking heart that the war had just taken a turn that no one had ever foreseen. The light against the void. The light against the void. The beacon of defiance, it was no longer a vessel of war alone. It had become a beacon of defiance against the darkness that threatened to consume the stars. Arion stood at the helm, his mind racing with the knowledge that the Voidborn had introduced a new force into the battle, one that defied the very laws of the cosmos. But he also knew that the Starborn had not come this far to be crushed by fear. The shadow that had emerged from the void was unlike anything the Starborn had ever faced. It was not a weapon of destruction, nor was it a simple force of nature. It was something else entirely, something that had not been accounted for in the ancient texts, something that had not been taught in the halls of Valerian. It was a force that could not be seen, yet it could be felt, pressing against the very soul of the Etherian and its crew. But Arion had never been one to surrender to the unknown. Commander Dane, he said, his voice steady, we need to find a way to counter this force. If we can't see it, we need to make it see us. Dane looked at him, his brow furrowed in thought. You think we can make it see us? I think we can make it see us. I think we have to try, Arion said. The Voidborn may have the advantage in numbers, but they don't understand the nature of the light. If we can use that to our benefit, we might be able to turn the tide. Catharian twisted through the void, its engines flaring with the light of the cosmos. The shadow followed, stretching and shifting, but Arion was not going to let it dictate the course of the battle. He had spent his life fighting for the Starborn, for the unity of the cosmos, and he would not allow fear to take hold now. The crew of the Catharians had always been a people of ingenuity, of wisdom, of light. And now, as the battle raged on, they would show the Voidborn that the Starborn were not merely warriors. They were the bearers of knowledge, the keepers of the light that had guided the stars for eons. Prepare the energy conduits, Arion ordered. We're going to use the Catharian's core to generate a pulse of light strong enough to disrupt the shadow. Dane hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "It's a risky move," he said. "If the pulse is too strong, it could damage the ship's systems." Arion met his gaze, his expression resolute. "Then we'll just have to make sure it's just the right amount." The crew of the Aetherian moved with purpose, their hands flying across the control panels as they prepared for the pulse. The ship's core flared with light, its energy surging through the vessel as the pulse was built. It was a force unlike anything the Starborn had ever wielded before, a weapon that did not rely on destruction but on the very essence of the cosmos itself. Then, with a final command from Arion, the pulse was released. If the pulse is the pulse was light, its energy surging through the vessel as the pulse was built. It was a force unlike anything the Starborn had ever wielded before. It surged outward, a brilliant explosion of energy that cut through the darkness like a blade of fire. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as if it had been struck by something it could not comprehend. The Aetherian was no longer a vessel of war. It was a beacon of light, a symbol of the Starborn's unyielding will. The Voidborn, who had been advancing with unrelenting force, now hesitated. Their ships, once so confident in their dominance, now stood in the face of something they had not anticipated. The shadow that had once seemed unstoppable now faltered, its form writhing as it struggled against the brilliance of the Starborn's light. And in that moment, Arion knew that the Starborn had found their advantage. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the Voidborn were no longer the only ones who had the power to shape the fate of the stars. The end of the war! The Aetherian had become a beacon of defiance, a symbol of the Starborn's unyielding will against the darkness that had threatened to consume the stars. The pulse of light had struck the shadow with a force the Voidborn could not comprehend, and in that moment, the tide of the battle had shifted. The Voidborn, who had once moved with the certainty of their own destruction, now hesitated. Their ships, once unrelenting in their advance, faltered as the light of the Aetherians and the Starborn fleet surged forward. Arion stood at the helm, his heart pounding with the weight of the moment. The battle had not been won in a single strike, nor had it been secured by a single act of defiance. It had been the culmination of every Starborn's belief, every moment of sacrifice, every act of courage that had brought them to this point. And now, as the Voidborn's forces withdrew, their once unshakable confidence broken, Arion knew that the war had reached its end. The Aetherian and its fleet had not only repelled the Voidborn's advance, they had shown them the power of the light, the strength of unity, the resilience of the Starborn. The Voidborn had come seeking dominion, believing that only through destruction could order be achieved. But the Starborn had shown them another path, one that did not rely on fear or annihilation, but on wisdom, on the light that had guided the cosmos for eons. And yet, the cost of the war had been great. The stars above, once a beacon of hope, now bore the scars of battle. The worlds that had been lost to the Voidborn's advance would never be restored, and the Starborn had suffered wounds that would not be easily mended. The faces of the fallen still haunted the memories of those who had survived, their sacrifices etched into the very fabric of the cosmos. But Arion knew that the Starborn had not come to the war for vengeance, nor for conquest. They had come to defend the light, to preserve the balance of the universe, to ensure that the stars would never again fall to the darkness. And though the war had cost them dearly, they had not been broken. As the Aetherian moved forward, the Voidborn's forces retreating into the void, Arion looked out at the stars, their light flickering like the breath of the cosmos. He had always believed that the Starborn were the true guardians of the universe, the only force capable of standing against the Voidborn. But now, as he stood upon the bridge of the Aetherian, he understood something deeper. The war had not been about victory or defeat. It had been about the choices made in the face of destruction, about the strength found in unity, about the belief that even in the darkest of times, the light of the cosmos would never be extinguished. The light of the cosmos would never be extinguished. The Voidborn had been defeated not by force alone, but by the very nature of the Starborn's existence. They had been shown that the light was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. That the stars were not merely a battlefield, but a home for those who had the will to protect them. And as the Aetherians sailed into the unknown, Arion knew that the war was over. But the stars would continue to shine, and the Starborn would stand as their eternal guardians, forever lighting the path for those who came after. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.